All right. Well, welcome to the Outside Our Walls podcast. I wanted to introduce you to a friend of mine. This is Wesley Towne. Wesley is a pastor in Davis. He is a campus pastor at Bayside Davis in California. It's outside the Bay Area, right? You're saying it's between Sacramento and San Francisco? Is that
Yep,
about where it
kind of
is?
split in the middle.
Okay. And you've only been there for, this is a weird time for you because you've only been there for like
It's
right
almost six
before the
months.
lockdown. It's
Yes.
like everything locks down and then you're the pastor there trying to
Yeah.
pastor people.
Welcome to your new job.
Yeah. This is going to be great. You're going to have a ton of relationships and then everything just goes down. And did they extended the lockdown, right? Like through, is it July or something? Like it was in
We don't
California, is that
know.
right?
It's pretty confusing now. The
Yeah.
original was May 31st. Well, before that it was another date, but now it's May 31st, and we have no idea what the plan is. It's all muddled and confusing at this point.
Hey, that's pastoral ministry. If it's not this, it'd be something else at some point. So, Wesley actually started a church in Oregon. How many years ago was that you planted?
2008. Started
2008
church at 26 years old.
at 26 years old. Just how that everybody draws it up, right? But man, it blew up. It's Ekklesia in Eugene. And still running, still going there. But you had to move down to California, maybe 3 years ago?
2018. So late summer 2018.
Okay, so it's 10 years that you were the lead pastor there.
Mm-hmm.
And just to make a connection, and I want to make sure everybody hears this from me, we've benefited at Anchor Church from Ekklesia in a number of different ways. It was really, I think one of the main ones is just their intentionality on excellence, like how to do things well, creatively, the creative aspect of how they did that. I remember thinking about church planting and just feeling like, man, there's no way that I want to plant a church if it's going to be crummy, because I just feel like that, especially where we live in Gilbert, it's like we can't do that. And looking at Instagram stalking Ekklesia, really in a lot of ways, just benefited from Wesley, from your intentionality there, and just thought, if they're meeting in a school and they're doing it really well. I love all your Instagram stuff. It's just creative. And I thought we can emulate this. So we've borrowed quote unquote, a number of things that you've done just because it was really good. So
Yeah.
thanks our church has benefited from you and your leadership, even though maybe they don't know it. So thanks for
Thanks, man.
how you're thinking through that kind of stuff.
Yeah, meeting in the school wasn't our intention. We just outgrew most of the buildings in our city within the first couple of years because our church grew so fast. And then we became a multi-campus church within the first 3.5, 4 years, and had a couple thousand people. It was crazy, and we just couldn't find a building. We didn't have the budget for it with a bunch of college students, so we had to make it work.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Well, you did a good job. I mean, my wife and I were in Eugene and went to Ekklesia for a Sunday after you left, but we were just impressed. We're like, this is, because we're thinking about what we were going to do. And it was like, this is great. It was just a really, really well done. So thanks for all you're doing there. And your wife's name's Kara. Is that correct?
Kara, yeah.
And you have a Chihuahua named Lucy that you love.
Yes. She is the best. She's a part Chihuahua, part Min Pin, part Dachshund, 5 pounds. Little Lucy is our go-to.
Yeah, if you see your Instagram stuff, you got Lucy everywhere. So
Yeah,
I love it. It's awesome. Well, I wanted to have you on, and I hope that everybody's going to benefit from this, because you have a podcast called Better Days that deals with just helping people think through mental health. Give me some reasons why you decided to start the Better Days podcast, and just your thoughts on it in general. How it's been helpful people. How you've been thinking about it.
yeah. Better Days is a podcast about mental health and suffering and what it means to be human and follow Jesus. And kind of the storyline behind why I started my podcast in late 2018, in my closet, which is so always amazing.
Perfect.
Where podcasts are being recorded and stuff. in my closet, was because just the story of my life, my wife's life, we've experienced a lot of suffering. And we both dealt with mental health challenges. Mine, severe anxiety, her anxiety and depression. She has a major spine condition. She's had multiple surgeries on her spine from two serious car accidents. She was almost paralyzed when we began to date, and had to kind of make her way back to some sense of normalcy through spine surgery and rehabilitation. But then in 2013, 5 years into our church plant, she got in another car accident, reshaped our life. We went on to kind of next 6 years in and out of the hospital, surgeries, new diagnoses with a major neurological condition based on brain injury. And so we've dealt with immense pain, suffering, loss, just the emotions behind suffering, especially long-term, chronic. You don't see like a finality or, some sort of solving it in sight. But this is kind of our life. And so at the same point in 2013, when she got in that car accident, I was exhausted from playing this church that grew really fast, was dealing with pretty severe anxiety for probably started 2 years into it. I dealt with anxiety since I think college, graduate school. I'm a really high achiever, also a perfectionist, and I push myself too hard sometimes, which creates stress physiologically, which, over time, if you don't recover from that and you continue in that state, it really wears you down. So I was at that point, 2013, having panic attacks, blacking out when I was teaching on Sundays. And
Hmm.
yeah, so I felt like after that point, 2013, I went on my own exploration of the church and how we deal with mental health and suffering, started teaching on it whenever I would travel outside of Ekklesia, and people kept saying, "Hey, we think you need to write a book, or we think you need to keep talking about this stuff." I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm just kind of figuring it out myself, so I'm just sharing it everywhere." And that's led to a lot of opportunities to talk about it, invites to write books. And I haven't written it yet, but I've been working on it. And also, we launched Better Days, which started with a podcast, a few listeners. I thought I was terrible at it, and has grown to just over 1,000 cities, 50, almost 60 countries. Like, just blown away by the need. I think the need in Christianity to think through these issues in a theological and physiological way. So yeah.
That's good, man. Well, I know that I've talked to people. I've had a few people that have dealt with anxiety, chronic anxiety, just that fear. Just dealing with some of those things. That I've pointed to the podcast and found it helpful. Actually, one of the things somebody said to me when I had them listen to it, a few episodes in, I think I asked them, "Hey, has it been helpful?" And they said, yes, because they could tell that you're writing um, from a from a perspective of someone who's walked through it. Like it's different
Mhm.
if it's different if you've never dealt with anxiety or mental health issues like that, and then you write about it from somebody that doesn't have the perspective. But I think that somebody that's walked through it can tell, hey, what you're describing is exactly what I'm feeling like, and
Hmm.
it's really helpful to have hope in it, or to feel like, okay, I'm not crazy, or this is not abnormal. And so anyway, I think it is helpful, and I'd love to read the book when you write it. How far
Yeah,
along are you?
working
How
on
far
it.
along are you on the book?
Well, I've developed most of the content over the last year and a half. So now it's phasing it all, fusing it all together, and really, really writing it out. So, but I've written a lot of stuff over the last couple of years, and yeah, now I got to figure out if I want. There's a publisher that's for the last 6 years asked me to write, and I'm trying to figure out if I want to do that or self-publish it, because I think we have a platform already, and we want to grow that. So I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, either way, man, I'm looking forward to that. I think that this is a really needed. It's one of those areas in the church that I think seems to be either um, you don't you don't think about mental health from a, even in a, counseling licensed counseling standpoint, like, we don't need to think about that because we have the Bible. Or let's throw out the Bible and just go with this other route. But I think that there's got to be, in some ways, there can be a marrying of the two, or at least an understanding of both that comes together, and we can think biblically about it, and have the, have the discussion, and then walk through this in a way that's going to serve people, especially as pastors, but even people that are walking through it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how, there's some people, let's just say somebody goes, I don't know how to think through clinical counseling. I don't know how to think through mental health because I've been told the Bible is all that I need, which the Bible is all we need for so many things, but the Bible is not prescriptive on so many things as well. It doesn't, there's a lot of gray. So how would you help somebody that's walking through, how do you marry those two things, those two worlds? How do you marry that? How have you thought through that? And how would you help somebody think through that category?
Yeah, such a good question. I think there's a lot of negative stereotypes, right? That's what a stigma is, about mental health within the church, especially in the West. And I think that's part of my goal is to deconstruct a lot of those false views and ideas theologically. I have a couple of masters in theological, biblical exegesis, and then religion, and also done some work in counseling. I'm starting a third master's in counseling focused on trauma and grief. And yeah, I feel like what we've done by placing negative stereotypes in the church around human issues, human realities, like a mental health challenge, is we have turned people away and shut people off and closed people up from finding healing and hope within the church because we have a very weak theology around anthropology, which is the study of what it means to be human. And mental health is not anything, disconnected from theology. Mental health is our well-being psychologically. So think of the life of the mind, emotionally, what I feel, these feelings that God has wired into me, socially, our relationships and our relationship dynamics, and then spiritually. I think all four of those facets of mental health are really important, and they're four key facets of what it means to be human. That's good theology right there, because God created all four of those. In addition to that, we're embodied beings. So God didn't create us just with this immaterial nature. He created us with a body. And what is immaterial, maybe our thoughts or our feelings, or our capacity to worship, also is connected to our body. So I think what we've done in the West is we've disassociated like certain elements of being human, or we've made some inferior. But God created us as multifaceted beings, and every part of what it means to be human works together in unison. Um, we're integrated beings, and so every part of mental health is God's creation. And I think what we need to get back to in the church is this understanding that mental health is actually something that God designed. Um, and
Right.
we need to understand what it means to be a multifaceted and integrated being, what it means to be human. Um, and none of these parts are an island, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so I think that a great example of that is like, okay, just like being a human, the things that I feel, the things that I touch, the things that I taste, the things that I see, the things that I hear actually influence my thinking and emotions. Another
Yes.
another idea behind this is, we talk a lot about in Christianity how we think, like our thought life, patterns of thinking. Patterns of thinking have a profound effect on our emotions, but also our body physiologically. They can create stress, anxiety, so on and so forth. So I think that getting back to that idea is really important because it is biblical, theological, woven into the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And
Yeah.
I love to tell people this: you can love Jesus and struggle with a mental health condition, because mental health conditions were born out of the fall. So all of these facets that God created, they now, because we don't live in Genesis 1 and 2 reality, we live in a Genesis 3 world. Um, all of us feel different facets of kind of the brokenness of creation. And some people, they feel it in their brains, or some people feel it in their bodies, some people feel it in their relationships. So all of us are going to have human struggles on this earth, but you can love Jesus at the same time.
Yeah, that's good. I think that is good because I think sometimes people can feel like, um, if I'm dealing with an anxious situation, let's like take for example, if I'm about to get hit by a bus, I'm gonna feel fear, and I'm gonna
Hmm.
there. If I know something's coming, there's gonna be anxiety. There's so many thoughts that, hey, anxiety is always a sin, or like, just like we can relate, we can bring those things together, and it doesn't mean that it's never not. Like sometimes you can deal with that, and maybe it is, but how would you help somebody that's dealing with that struggle, maybe even just shame or guilt of feeling like, man, why am I struggling with anxiety, and trying to get over that from a guilt shame standpoint, but walk through it theologically. How would you help somebody with that?
Yeah. I think it's important that people are informed. I think when people are misinformed, they get into cycles of guilt, and they feel heavy when they have these natural, normal human feelings. So the Bible says, do not fear a lot, but you got to look at the context around that. God never says that feeling fear is wrong. Um, and God never says that feeling anxiety is wrong. In fact, it's impossible not to feel fear or anxiety around certain situations. We've been wired with a response, physiologically, to fear, to dangerous situations, that God has wired a protective system in it. We call it the fight, flight, or freeze response. But actually, it's interesting. Bessel van der Kolk, who's kind of the leading expert, maybe foremost expert in the world on trauma, teaches how, when we go through traumatic situations in life, it actually, trauma and grief embeds itself in our bodies and our brains, and kind of the physiological nature of what happens. So let's say like you're about to get hit by a bus, or one day I was in San Diego and I was filling up my gas tank next to the airport, and all of a sudden, like four cop cars pull over a black BMW, and the cops got out with their guns. Like they took out their guns, like they took their guns out. And I was like, I ducked into my car. I felt all kinds of fear, anxiety. That's normal. It's impossible not to feel that.
Right.
Let me give you a quote from Bessel van der Kolk about how our brain actually functions around this stuff. The emotional brain initiates pre-programmed escape plans, like the fight or flight responses. These muscular and physiological reactions are automatic, set in motion without any thought or planning on our part, leaving our conscious, rational capacities to catch up later, often well after the threat is over.
Hmm.
So what Bessel van der Kolk is saying as a brain scientist and a expert in trauma is that our brain actually responds before we can even think about it and process it, interpret it, and then respond to it, kind of in a rational way. So feeling these feelings is normal. It's how we process them and how we then respond when we're able to, that is key.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that where it gets to be real sticky, and I don't know if it is sticky. I think it feels sticky is when people start to go down roads. I think we're all susceptible. This is where the guilt comes in, of like, I'm not trusting the Lord. So like, okay, I'm still dealing with fear or whatever. I'm dealing with this issue, and it just must mean that I am not trusting God here, because if I did trust God, I wouldn't feel this.
Yeah.
um and I think that's hard. I mean, that's the complexity of the human brain, I think, but also just the human experience, and like you said, living in a Genesis 3 world. It's not Genesis 1. That'd be great if it was Genesis 1, but it's not. Great. It's great. We're grateful that we live. It's grateful that we live post um, resurrection. So there's resurrection power. We experience that. We know Jesus is the King of the universe, and we can trust Him for those things. It doesn't mean that that every single aspect of my brain is wired right. Right. I mean, I still deal with kinds of things. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we live in the in between, right? We're in this parentheses of time where already so much redemption and healing and transformation is taking place, but we're still awaiting Romans chapter 8. Paul's like, I groan, anticipating
Mm.
the redemption of our bodies. Like, we're groaning in this
Yeah.
in-between state. That's our reality. It's just being human in a broken
Yeah.
space. And I think so much of what you're saying is really, really good. And I think we give oversimplified answers to complex problems. So you're going to feel these feelings, right? You just need to learn how to respond to them, how to think them through, how to process them in a healthy way. Like one clinical psychologist who I work with to do some, talks and things like that, video series and things. She said we feel up to 34,000 emotions. That's complex, right? Like
That is complex, man.
we're feeling a lot of feelings, so it's not a
Yeah.
sin to feel feelings.
Right.
And but we do want to respond to them in a healthy way.
Yeah, right. Which matters in the long run. Yeah, it does. One specific thing I'd love you to just to address that I think could help us think through this a little bit, or at least peel the onion back a little bit more. Back in you wrote on your website, which is wesleytown.com, right? And
Hmm.
we'll try and let people know where to find that. But back in March 2019, you wrote a journal article about anxiety, and one of the things that you said in there, and this is a quote, you said, which is what you just said. Many of the teachings I have heard on anxiety lack context and broader biblical research. Moreover, these teachings are often overly simplistic in nature. And you define that by one example from Philippians 4, which I think is really good. I'd love for you just to pull on this string a little bit more. But you mentioned, and Philippians 4 is that the verse that, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. But you said the questions that should come from this text, or that you've asked, is every feeling of anxiety bad? Is the emotion of anxiety a sin? Should I ever feel concerned or scared? What should I do in situations when anxiety suddenly arises in me beyond my control? Is prayer the cure-all for all forms of anxiety? If I pray more, will God really erase all the feelings of anxiety in me? And all of those, I think that how we answer some of those questions is going to help us process theologically because it does come down to, if I just pray, that means I should not feel these things. There's one reading of Philippians 4. If I pray with thanksgiving, rejoicing always, I should not feel this, and there should just be a peace that surpasses understanding, and I should be at that spot. Therefore, if I'm not there, man, something's wrong with me. It adds to the anxiety or the fear or the frustration. But if we could read that section of scripture in a way that the application isn't any different. We're like, yeah, the Lord is everything, but maybe how we think through the prayer and what that prayer does and how we land on the other side of that, it could change everything in terms of how somebody walks out of that and doesn't feel odd or
Hmm.
ungodly. So help me, like, people that are going to listen to this, I think some of them are going to be dealing with anxiety. Help me with that section. Help me with
Yeah.
thinking through some of the answers to those questions.
So let's start with that passage and then I'll work my way outside of it. I think when we talk about anxiety in church, we tend to talk about it within the framework of Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Do not be anxious about anything. But we often don't talk about it within its context, just the immediate context of Philippians 4, 6, and 7. And then one of the things you learn as a Christian who teaches the Bible is you never make a doctrine out of one verse or two verses in one passage. You've got to look outside the scope in the book. You've got to look at the New Testament, Old Testament. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about anxiety, we've done a really poor job inside of Christianity, and that's not to put any negative viewpoint on anybody, but we just haven't done a good job of really like doing the research. And so Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is interesting because the same guy who wrote "Do not be anxious about anything" in chapter 2, Paul, wrote that I'm anxious. I'm sending one of my coworkers to you so that I may be less anxious. And then that same guy, Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he said that same term, that he had anxiety every single day for the churches. He was carrying a heaviness, a burden, and anxiety for the churches that he had planted and that he was pastoring, because he pastored remotely quite a bit as he traveled and started new churches and went to different regions. And so he carried anxiety every single day, which is intriguing, right? So you even take it outside of that scope, outside the New Testament. Um, in the Old Testament, you see anxiety, like, for example, Hannah. She's praying. She couldn't, she couldn't get pregnant, and there's a lot of social stigma around that. She was going through a personal crisis, trauma, and she was accused of being drunk in prayer. But she's like, I'm not drunk. I haven't drinking anything. Like, I'm speaking out of the vexation of my soul and my great anxiety. So we see
Hmm.
anxiety around the idea of like trauma or personal crisis. And in that day, that was a major social stigma. So she had a lot of stress around that reality and a lot of grief. And so what I've learned is that Philippians 4, 6, and 7, the term there actually is referring to our thought life, obsessive concerns. So when we're obsessively worrying or concerned about something, there's a healthy concern, because that's what Paul's talking about in chapter 2, and then 2 Corinthians chapter 11 when he's talking about his daily anxieties. The term literally just means concern. So when he says do not be anxious about anything in Philippians 4, 6, and 7, he's talking about the mind. So we got to make sure we understand the context. And he's talking about obsessive concerns. In other words, we shouldn't be living um, paralyzed in the present because we have these obsessive concerns about the future, obsessive fears about the future. That's really the context of Philippians 4, 6, and 7. And so when we say to somebody, you should never feel anxious um, because of Philippians 4, 6, and 7, we need to redefine that. And
Hmm.
we also need to be careful how we communicate that, because anxiety in the clinical sense is much broader. A person can feel anxiety just because of situation, right? That's not a sin. Um, a dangerous situation. A person can feel anxiety because of trauma. They've been through trauma, and trauma actually rewires the brain and it embeds itself in the body. And so that person needs really good trauma counseling. They need a relational home to process what they went through so that they
Yes.
can find healing and talk to God about it.
Right.
Because God is present and loves the brokenhearted. Psalm 34:18. Um, you can also have anxiety because of a biological malfunction
Yep.
with your glandular system, with your brain. A lot of women don't know this, but when you have a major fluctuation of hormones, that actually creates anxiety, and there's no sin in that. That's just a
Right.
part of the brokenness of living on planet Earth. And so I think we need to be really careful about how we use Philippians 4, 6, and 7, because yes, we want to pray about everything in all of those contexts, but it Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is not a pill to swallow where every person in every anxious context is going to be healed immediately. If we say that to somebody who's been through trauma or experiencing trauma at the moment, and they go home and try to do that, like, oh, I'm never supposed to feel anxious, I need to pray, I need to trust God, and then all of a sudden they do that week after week, year after year, they're going to start to feel spiritually inferior and discouraged, like God isn't showing up, God must not care about me, God must not
Hmm.
love me. Well, they're feeling that way because we've misapplied that text.
Yes.
And that's our fault, not their fault, right?
Right.
So
Right.
we need
Right.
to do a better job of helping people spiritually by giving them informed answers around these complex human issues.
Yeah. Man, that's so good. I feel like those are things we're trying really hard to understand, and which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on here, because I think that's so helpful. The theological, like the exegesis of texts, and bringing it out into a way that's gonna help us think through it in a way that's gonna be I don't want to say redemptive, but in some ways redemptive for somebody that deals with that. I think is so. It's the church. I think is missing the boat on it. I think that the church largely, and I think it's just an area we need to grow in. It's really a loving of people. It's a care for our brothers and sisters. We think about Romans. We want to weep with those who weep, and so
Yes.
I think oftentimes, sometimes the church can crush those that weep, um, or push them aside because they're not thinking similarly. And just like we want to rejoice with those rejoice, weep with those who weep. Let's do it as best as we possibly can. And I think this is one area where we can just grow. And as a pastor, I want to make sure I'm growing here, and we're leading our church, because I wanted the church to be a safe place for people that have had trauma or that do deal with these things. I want our church to be a place where someone can come in and find a shoulder to cry on and not judgment immediately, which I think oftentimes, unfortunately, that can be the case. Not all the time, but I think that historically that's just an area that we just need to continue to grow in. It's like I would say with what Paul says, I think it's the Colossians, or the Thessalonians. Yeah, you guys are growing here, but excel still more. Like keep pressing in, keep loving people, and do that as best as you possibly can. Which actually leads me to my last kind of question for you. One of the things that you've said, I've heard you say it a number of times, that I just think is a phrase that we need to get stuck in our minds. I'd love for you to expand upon it. Is that it's okay not being okay. We just need to understand that, hey, sometimes we're not okay. And it's okay if that's the case. Just expect, where did you come up with that phrase? How do you think about it? How should we apply it? How should we apply that?
Yeah, I think it's a popular phrase outside the church, because human beings realize that life is hard, right? If we live in a world that has walked away from God's original design and intention, we're going to feel some pretty hard things. We're going to experience some pretty hard things and challenges. And God, we read things like James chapter 1, where it says, to consider all joy when you face trials of many kinds, knowing that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, so on and so forth. And we think, like when we face trials and troubles and struggles and pain and suffering in life, we're supposed to be happy. That's what God's teaching us. Well, no, he's not teaching that. He's saying, consider all joy, because in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your suffering, God is present and working, right? God is redemptive, even in the midst of our hardship. So I think he's not, we don't have to be happy about the sufferings and challenges of life. It's okay not to be okay. For example, the Psalms of Lament, that's 1/3 of the Psalms. Psalms of Lament are 1/3
Yes.
of the way that God's people worshiped God in ancient times. And you're like, what's a lament? A lament was an honest, emotional dialogue with God about the brokenness and struggles and pain and suffering that we experience in this world. And people were really honest with God. They challenged him. They cried out. They shared their frustrations, and they emoted, right? Emotions in our context are always viewed as a negative. Like we think rational is better than emotional. Well, God doesn't say that ever in the Bible. You can't find one place in scripture to prove this idea that our emotions are inferior and negative. In fact, they're actually beautiful and wonderful. They were supposed to be designed in a way that functions according to God's design, and a part of our worship and a part of our relationships. And so God allowed his people to emote in honest ways. And I think it's a beautiful thing. When Job went through his suffering, Job wasn't happy. Chapter 3 of Job post all of these like kind of cascading points of suffering in his life. Job actually said, I wish I was never born. I wish I was the product of a miscarriage. That's what Job said, literally in the original language. That was his language, because he was suffering. He said, don't ever celebrate my birthday again. I don't want anybody to celebrate my life again, because he was so depressed over just really, really tough and widespread suffering that most of us will never experience. And then Jesus, right? Like we think of Jesus as like happy, clappy, everything's always good and wonderful. That's how we describe Jesus in the West. But Isaiah describes Jesus in Isaiah 53 verse 3 as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief.
Right.
Like, how many of us describe Jesus that way? Like, yes, it's okay not to always feel happy and excited and everything's going great. Like, even Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And because I have a background in biblical languages, I dug into those terms. And those terms are referring to mental and emotional pain and anguish, which then, kind of relates back to the mental health thing, subject. And so I think as Christians, it's okay. Suffering's hard and painful. Paul says we groan in anticipation for the redemption of our bodies and the renewing of all things. And it's just normal and healthy to be real and human. And I think the more that we do that in the church, the more we invite people in, because suffering and mental health challenges is not the minority in our churches, it's the majority. People
Yeah.
just are afraid to open up, because we need to open up like a healthy conversation around these realities.
Yeah. That's really good. Yeah, I just know that man, people need to hear this stuff, because I think it's just, it's helpful to have a category that says Jesus struggled mentally as well. Like, so just even, I mean, the Garden of Gethsemane is a good example.
Yeah. Yep.
Difficult season for him, but he is trusting the Lord. But trusting the Lord doesn't, it's not a switch, right? It's not like, okay, I'm going to trust the Lord now. Let's flip the off switch off onto my fear and anxiety or whatever other mental health issue we have. It's not an on or off switch. I can trust the Lord through it. We just talked through a couple Sundays ago. We're going through fruit of the Spirit, like how to think through that in this season of life. So we were talking through Jesus calming the storm, and so he didn't. I mean, Jesus led them into the sea. So he actually is the one that's like, let's do this. Um, and the fear, it's like, he's not going to help us avoid those situations. It's just when we go through them, what's our posture? And I think that it doesn't mean that we're not going to struggle. It means that some of it helps us trust him even more, because
Agreed.
as we walk through it, we just recognize, I don't have any hope but you. It causes us to run to him. And sometimes that's what we need. I think Paul found that out. And my guess is a lot of the disciples did, if not all of them, at some point found
Yeah.
that out. Like, what I need is Jesus. And so, the Lord redeems it, and he uses it, and he'll use it. And it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. And it doesn't mean that it's not hard. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that this life, Paul related this to pastoral ministry sometimes, but Paul said to live is Christ, but man, to die is better. To die is gain. Like, there's something, because the longer you live, the more you realize this world stinks, like in a lot of different ways. We live here,
Mhm.
and we live on mission, and we want to see people come to know the Lord, and we want to help them find hope. But this world is hard. And sometimes it is because of suffering and pain and mental health issues and all of that. And so I think the things that you're saying are so needed, and I'm just grateful for it. I'm grateful that you're taking the steps, getting another master's to further help us understand it, and to walk through it. And I'm so thankful that you're willing to take some time here today to talk through it. I'd love to have you. How can we hear more from you? Where can we go to learn more about this, to benefit from your wisdom on it? Where can we go? Give us some places that we can search for you and find you.
Yeah, Better Days podcast is on all digital platforms. So whether you're on Spotify, Apple, Google, whatever it is, it's pretty easy to find. And I just finished a season 4 about crisis. So like really getting to the anatomy of crisis and how to walk through it in a healthy way, how to
Great.
respond to all the challenges of crisis. And now I'm preparing for season 5. I can't tell you what it is because it's kind of in the cooker, and
Okay.
it's going to be awesome. But
Awesome.
yeah, and then I just started a series for leaders on suffering that I'm writing a 10-part series on my website wesleytowne.com about like what it's like to suffer as a leader and
Hmm.
how to like walk through that, because
Oh man, that's so
it
needed.
brings just an added challenge. Leadership is already complex and hard,
Yeah.
so then how do you add personal or family suffering into that
Hmm.
mix? I've lived it. So I'm doing a 10-part series on that, just short little journal entries on my website, wesleytowne.com. And then Better Days is about to launch a bunch of new stuff this year. We're getting ready to launch a website, and we're going to have a video series, some written materials for the church, and hopefully I get that book finished in the next year.
Yeah, for sure, man, for sure. Well, I hope this is helpful. I'm sure it's helpful for me to process through it and think through it. You've been helpful for me. Your podcast has been helpful. Um, so I'm just grateful that you take some time, man, and talk with me about this. I'm sure we'll be in touch again. We'll link the your website and Better Days podcast in the description
Cool. Thanks so
below.
much.
Yeah. And let us know if there's anything we can do for you, man. We'd love to just continue to benefit from what you're saying. And thanks for pastoring in a pandemic. And
Yes.
you can't get to know people face to face, but I think one last thing, this podcast is going to be helpful for people in this season, I think, because man,
Hmm.
it's hard. Like, this is hard, and there's going to be anxiety and fear, and suicide rates, I think, are up. And so
Yes.
I just think that we just need to process through this and as a church come alongside. So thanks, man. I appreciate you taking some time with
Thank
us
you.
today. Yeah, man.
Appreciate it.
We'll talk again. See you, man.
Cool. Thanks for
Later.
having me.
Yeah,
So
man.
great
All
chatting
right.
with you. Okay.
Great chat with you too.
Bye.
All right. Bye.